Welcome back to Beyond the Bible. Today we're going to take a look at something special, one of the languages that the Bible was originally written in. Today we're taking a look at Biblical Hebrew. Now this is the language that most of the Old Testament was written in. There are a few portions that were originally written in a language called Aramaic. But what on earth is Hebrew? What does it look like? How can you tell what it is? We're going to take a look at that today. Hebrew is a Northwest Semitic language. Perhaps you've heard the term Semitic or Semite before. Those words come from the name of one of Noah's sons from the Bible, his son Shem. From Shem are where the Jews and the rest of Middle Eastern peoples descend from, according to the Bible. And so that's the kind of language that Hebrew is. There's a number of things that distinguish it from other languages. First of all, Hebrew is one of a few languages that you write from right to left, which is different from English, for example. All the sentences and paragraphs, they all start on the right side of the page, which is good news for those of you who are left-handed, because if you write in Hebrew, you're not going to have all that smudging that you normally do when you're writing in English. And of course, when you read a book, you open it backwards from English in Hebrew. Books start from the back end and work their way frontward. Hebrew has an alphabet, just like English does. It consists of 22 letters, though you have to remember to start writing your letters and reading them on the right side and go to the left. You can actually see the Hebrew alphabet in action numerous times in the Bible in acrostic poems, where each line or each stanza of a psalm or a poem begins with the next successive letter of the alphabet. A great example where you can find this is in Psalm 119. Every 8 verses, each stanza starts with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And in most English Bibles, it tells you before each section of 8 what the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet is. That's a good way to learn them. Hebrew syntax or sentence structure is different from English as well. In English, we do subject, verb, object. But in Hebrew, it's verb, subject, object. Take a look at the following example. In Hebrew, you might have a sentence that looks something like, will observe the judges the law. Whereas in English, we would say, the judges will observe the law. Vocabulary is a little bit difficult in Hebrew as well, because the vast majority of the words in Hebrew are based on 3-letter roots, which might sound really simple until you consider that you're trying to memorize hundreds of the same 22 letters put into 3-letter combinations. It gets a little tricky memorizing vocabulary. For example, you've got the root MLK. Depending on the vocalization you use for vowels and a couple of different letters, you can have all sorts of different words, like Malach, which means to rule, Melech, which means king, Malka, which means queen, and Malkut, which means kingdom. Making things even a little bit more complicated is that originally Hebrew texts and documents didn't have spacing in between the words and had very little in the way of punctuation. You have to really know the language and know what it is you're reading in order to know where to break the different words and sentences apart. One last difficult thing about Hebrew is that it's a language that doesn't have any vowels. All 22 letters from the alphabet are consonants. The only way to understand how to use vowel sounds or vocalize in between the different letters is by context. You basically need to grow up learning the language or really, really study it. Which brings us to our next subject. What's the development of Hebrew look like over time? Well, it starts off as Biblical Hebrew, the language that is used in the Old Testament. And this comes onto the scene around the 10th century BC. In the 6th century BC, after Babylon had destroyed Jerusalem and the first temple, Biblical Hebrew started going into decline, and it went into even further decline after 70 AD, when Rome had destroyed Jerusalem again and destroyed the second temple. This led to a second stage or era in the life of Hebrew called Mishnaic Hebrew, which takes place from about the 1st through the 4th centuries AD. Now, this era of Hebrew, a number of really important Jewish texts were written. One of them is called the Mishnah, where we get the word Mishnaic. The Mishnah is a Jewish religious text that expounds on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. It's essentially a commentary on the Torah. Another really important work written during this time is called the Talmud. The Talmud expounds on the Mishnah, so it's kind of a commentary of the Torah. And both of these are examples of what Jews call oral Torah. That is, the language contained in these documents was originally spoken orally by people. So usually you'll have phrases like, Rabbi so-and-so said this about this particular topic or passage in the Old Testament. And this other rabbi had a different interpretation or take on that. And here's what he said. During this time frame, some Hebrew was still being spoken, but a lot of it was more literarily based. Then we get to the 3rd era, which is medieval Hebrew. This is from the 4th through the 19th centuries AD. And during this time period, Hebrew is almost exclusively being used literarily and liturgically. However, from the 6th to 10th centuries AD, there was a group of Jewish scholars and teachers called the Masoretes. They developed a vowel system for Hebrew. They started realizing that Hebrew was falling so much out of usage and people weren't really able to vocalize it properly anymore. They couldn't really read it. But they didn't want to invent new letters and insert them in between the letters of the text. They wanted to keep the text whole and intact and not really mess with it in any way. So the Masoretes developed a series of dots and dashes that go primarily above and below the letters of Hebrew in order to sustain literacy in this language. And it actually worked. If you pick up a Hebrew Old Testament today, it will most likely have this series of dots and dashes on it. The Masoretic text, as it's called. Finally, this leads us into modern Hebrew, which, by the way, just like original biblical Hebrew, doesn't use any vowels. Modern Hebrew started in the 19th century AD and has continued all the way until the present. Now, Hebrew literacy was practically extinct by the 19th century. And at this point in time, we have something called the Zionist movement, where Jews and allies of Jewish people are starting to think that the Jews, as God's people, need to be able to go back to Israel once again. And so there is a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda. He became convinced that Hebrew needed to once again be learned by the Jews. And so he developed a dictionary with tens of thousands of Hebrew words inside of it. And he started teaching Jewish people, and they learned it. And then they taught it to their children as their first language, even though it wasn't the first language of the parents. And then it just continued to spread. And now there are literally millions of Hebrew speakers all around the world, where Hebrew is their first language. This is so unique. There are no other natural languages on earth that have gone from 0 native speakers to having millions of native speakers. Though I will point out, modern Hebrew is quite a bit different from biblical Hebrew. It still has all the same letters, and many of the words are the same, but it draws from all sorts of other languages like Yiddish and Arabic And of course, there's all sorts of words that didn't exist back when biblical Hebrew existed, like the word car or toaster. Those just weren't things at that time. But what difference does all of this make? What takeaways are there? Why is a language like biblical Hebrew important? Well, for starters, it's the original language that the Old Testament was written in. Everything else is simply a translation. And translations, many of them, are very good and capture the essence of what the Hebrew is trying to say. But sometimes it can be difficult to know exactly what a translation is trying to get at. It can pay off to be able to go back to the original text. So it's extremely helpful if you have a minister at your church or a teacher that knows something about biblical Hebrew. Ask them questions if you ever have one pop up about what a particular passage says or what's going on in this Old Testament story. Now, you might not have the fortune of having a minister at your church that knows anything about Hebrew, but most Bible colleges and seminaries have professors that are either really, really proficient in Hebrew or at least good enough that they're able to teach it to their students. You can always email them a question. Now, most of the questions that professors receive from outsiders are things like, is this Hebrew tattoo that I have correct? Does it say the right thing? And half the time it's not. So you might want to ask before you get the tattoo. But they would be thrilled if you have a genuine Bible or theology question to ask them. If for some reason you would like to start learning some stuff about biblical Hebrew for yourself, there are a few books that you can pick up that are starter books. One is called Introduction to Biblical Hebrew by Thomas O. Lambden, and the other is called Basics of Biblical Hebrew by Gary DePratico and Miles Van Pelt. And here's the thing. You don't have to become fluent in a biblical language. Just being able to learn how to use a few tools in order to look things up or look through a dictionary or be able to, look up a word or the meaning of something, that can be very, very helpful. And of course, I should point out, without the Old Testament, we don't have the New Testament, making biblical Hebrew that much more of an important language for people to understand in order to get back to the roots of the Bible, the very Word of God. But for now, that's our look beyond the Bible. I'll see you next time.